Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, IoT Value and Risks in Today's Connected Environment, sponsored by Vencor on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest is Barry Barlow, the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at Vencor. Now, Barry, right before break, you said something that really kind of piqued my attention a little bit about offensive cybersecurity, if you will, or offensive cyber efforts. And it's not well talked about in the government. And when we talk about the government's role when it comes to this broadening concept of Internet of Things, the government, whether it's Defense Department or DHS or whomever, they don't talk too much about offensive capabilities. But you made a really, again, interesting point about maybe there's some deterrence that's needed. Talk a little bit about why you think that is needed.
Sure. So we are the most powerful cyber nation in the world. We have a lot of capabilities, but we don't want to use those capabilities without the right cause. What would those red lines be that would force us to do something? I believe an attack on our critical infrastructure, because if we were in a situation where our electrical grid went down and it went down for an extended period of time, that would be a threat that would be something we would need to look at what to do. Similarly, the financial sector. If someone were to go down and take down Wall Street and the related things, that would have an effect on us, and not just us, but around the world, because the economies are connected. So I do believe there are situations that require a response. Is it somebody going and wiping out Sony's servers? Probably not. But on the other hand, there are critical items that should be addressed.
And I think a lot of times as a society, we don't quite understand that until it happens, right? If you think back to the early 2000s, they had the brownouts in the Northeast area. There was a lot of concern. Was that a cyber attack, or was that just trees and vines and taking down? And in the end, I think people felt like if it was a cyber attack, would have that been big enough to cross that red line? So let's look at specific markets, if you will, industries. Healthcare is one good one. The IoT is a huge growing market there. At what point does healthcare really become the bigger concern? Or I guess, what point does it raise to the level where people go, whoa, we got to do something?
So in that particular case, take a typical hospital. You have patients that are connected to devices, and we expect that inside a hospital. We want to be monitored. We want to have doctors or nurses looking out for us. And there was a study by the University of Pennsylvania, Southern California, Dartmouth, where they found that's actually one of the most vulnerable places, because the cyber hygiene practices inside a hospital are really very poor, because you have doctors that are coming in and out of rooms. They don't want to be logging on. They don't want to be carrying two-factor authentication devices. And so that represents certainly an attack surface. But not just that. We now have individuals who carry insulin pumps that are connected. Pacemakers are also connected. If you're in a clinical trial, you're connected as well. And so something like that, whether it was an attack on an individual or a community through a hospital, is something that we would have to look at what the right retaliatory response would be.
You bring up an interesting point about all the different connected devices. And in many ways, something like an iPhone, where you have your thumbprint now can log you on, would be a simple way to kind of get toward that two-factor authentication piece. But the concern, at least with medical devices, is the time, right? If a doctor or a nurse needs to do something now and they need to get onto the machine, they can't, that half a second or whatever it is to get your thumbprint or your fingerprints on could be too long. I think that's why that's a part of that, as you said, the most vulnerable places. And the Veterans Affairs Department, as an example, is feeling that challenge, how they make that right balance, because they have the federal regulations, and then they also have the needs of the doctors, patients, and nurses. Talk a little bit about, in the healthcare world, how do you balance those needs?
Well, I do believe you have to balance the needs, just as you said. Yes, there's a need to be able to render the medical care, but there's also this need to make sure that you can render it. It's almost like the Hippocratic Oath of first do no harm. There was a study that was published in January this year that says we need a Hippocratic Oath for cyber medical devices. And it talked in there about, first, we need to do an inventory of all the medical devices that are out there and understand the risk posture for those. And then the hospitals and the doctors' practices need to go through and apply a risk management framework to those, just as we do the computer networks at our house. And lastly, I think all of us need to assume that there's zero trust in the network really at any point in time. And so we have to put the provisions in place that I'm going to assume that I'm not safe. So I'm going to do everything I can to protect the data in transit, the data in rest, and the data while it's being processed.
And I think that's the other piece of it is protecting the data, because it's one thing if you're trying to, if you will, get at somebody or at least cause harm, you could turning that insulin from 1 to 5 could really hurt somebody. And, or the same thing with saying, well, they got their medication, at 2 o'clock when they really got it at 10 a.m. So all of that could be harmful, and changing the data is so important. Where does the government's role play in that? Is it HHS who has to play a bigger role? Do you get a sense of where the connection has to come?
Well, I do believe HHS has to play a role in that, but I also believe there's a commerce aspect of that as well. Because if you think about the way we buy medical devices, we get many of them at our local pharmacy through prescriptions. And so the data has to be protected for that entire life cycle. And so that's going to make it a whole of government problem as opposed to just a specific case.
I think we're going to have a common theme here, the whole of government problem when it comes to IoT and cybersecurity. Let's talk about electrical. That's another area, another industry that's seeing a huge growth in these connected devices and is providing both a bigger attack surface and more concerns. Talk a little about the electrical world in terms of how they're dealing with IoT and cybersecurity.
Yeah, within the electrical community, this has been a concern for really the last 5 years, and only for about the last 5 years. In 2013, the House committee published a report and said, high-profile breaches at Target, they attract the public's eye, but the threat is much greater in the critical infrastructure. And it was on the heels of that the president signed out the executive order, which went through and put out a set of standards that required voluntary compliance. Now, PwC does a survey every year across many sectors, and one of those is the utility sector. And what they found was that whether it was oil and gas or electrical, that only about 40% of the people thought they were in a good cyber place. But the reality was when they had independent people come in to look at it, it was really only about 5 to 15% of the 3,600 utilities were in a good place. And the reality beyond that is that they really should be at 100%, but because of the fact that we all depend upon that. And so there's a gap between where we think we are, where we need to be, and where we really are. And it's something that has to be addressed.
It's interesting that I know that the Obama administration got a lot of pushback on the EO compliance versus mandatory. I know industry did not want to be a part of the mandatory. They really pushed for the voluntary compliance. Is that the hole in this system right now? Is that someone has to somewhere say, you need to do this. Here's your minimum. Here's the floor you need to be on.
It is. And they need to make it something such that the board of directors or the executives at those companies understand that they have some personal or corporate liability if they don't do that. We've seen cases in other industry segments, whether it's failed airbags at one car manufacturer or even more recently, phones that catch on fire. Those companies have corporate liability. And in the utility sector, whether that comes through a public service commission within a state or at a federal level, there needs to be this idea of mandatory compliance. Now, as a consumer, we're going to pay for that because everything that they spend gets passed through a rate case and there's going to be a charge for it. But it's not unlike what happened when TSA put the charge on every airline ticket to keep us safe when we get on a plane.
It's interesting that you're calling for a little mandatory. I know a lot of people are not going to be happy with you on this, so be prepared for those emails and tweets that say, "What are you doing to us?" But I think in many ways, if you're not held to a standard, is the profit motive enough to hold someone to say, "Well, if we know that if we have problems, we're going to lose profit." In the electrical industry, I'm not sure that's the case because so many are state regulated, federal regulated, and there's not a lot of competition for. When I plug into the wall, I get my electricity from one company.
I agree, and that's why I characterize this idea of mandatory compliance around these highly regulated, monopolistic trade segments, because in that case, those companies are given the privilege really of providing us power or providing us medical devices. And so they need to be held to a higher standard. And on the profit margin being enough, I think look at the news over the last 18 months, and it certainly hasn't been enough in any breach, whether it's Target, Yahoo, or even in the government, OPM.
Right. I think those are fair points. And I think the highly regulated areas, I think, are key to really, if they're going to impact our lives so much, they have to be held to a certain standard. Let's look at the opposite side where competition is happening and competition is driving better technology. That's in the transportation industry. The number of cars that are coming out, the autopilot, the Tesla, other GM or whomever is really starting to look at how can we have connected cars and the concerns there. Talk a little bit about how IoT and cybersecurity are coming together.
Well, there I do believe the competition is working in our favor because a high-profile attack on a manufacturer could take an entire product line offline. And so what we're seeing is there was about a year ago an attack against a particular manufacturer, and that manufacturer went out and they got the best and brightest to come in and say, help me secure my car. They didn't say, we're going to eliminate Bluetooth, we're going to run away from this. No, they put the mechanisms in place to protect that. And I think we're seeing that now propagate across their competition because they're saying, well, we want to have connected cars too, and we want them to be as safe. And so we're bringing those technologies to bear.
Do you see a difference between, for instance, what transportation is doing with IoT and what HHS or commerce or energy is doing? Do you see, are they all kind of moving down a wide but similar path, or are they going down maybe different paths that eventually are going to have to come together?
I do believe they're connected. The individual in Homeland Security, Dr. Andy Osmond, is trying to shepherd those roles over each of those autonomous departments. And he's working with the appropriate individuals in that to try to improve the overall federal cyber posture.
This has been a fascinating conversation, Barry. I've very much enjoyed going through all the different segments. What's the big takeaway in your world, in your viewpoint? What should our listeners, whether they're federal agencies or whether they're in industry or regular average citizens, understand about IoT and cybersecurity?
Well, one, we need to understand that the connected fabric is only going to get much larger. We've gone from, in 1996, 20 years ago, the average of one connected device per person, up to now, it's about 7 connected devices per person. And in 2020, it's going to be about a dozen. So the attack surface is going to expand. And we are at a point in time where we can do something about it. For me, the analogy is similar in the run-up to World War II, when Winston Churchill said, when the situation was manageable, it was neglected. And now that it's thoroughly out of hand, we apply too late these lessons that we've learned too long. And so he was making the case that we're at a point where we have to do something. We waited too late, and now we see what has happened. I don't want that to be said of us in industry, that we waited too late, or in government, that we didn't have the foresight, because we certainly have that. It's just a matter of having the will to follow through.
And is there something that you and I, as members of like the public, can do to understand? Okay, if I'm connecting my Fitbit, I'm connecting my phone and my refrigerator and my car and everything else, what are some easy things that maybe they could do, you and I, the average citizen, could do?
Well, in general, what I do is I leave my devices unconnected unless I'm using it to minimize that time. And so whether it's a baby cam or a thermostat, I will connect when I have to go through and get updates or things like that. But I'm not going to leave it always connected, because you're just expanding your risk profile.
Great advice. This was a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today. You've been listening to the panel discussion, IoT Value and Risks in Today's Connected Environment, sponsored by Vencor on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'd like to thank my guest, Barry Barlow, the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at Vencor. Barry, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. It's been fun.
I'm your host, Jason Miller. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search Vencor.